The transport truck shuddered to a halt, and Greta Schuller felt the heat before she even saw the light. It pressed through the canvas walls like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Nothing like the dry cold of Berlin in winter, or even the Mediterranean warmth she'd known in North Africa. This was different. This was biblical. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Raus! Raus! The American Guard's German was functional but graceless, his accent twisting the words into something almost comical. But nobody laughed. The 23 women inside the truck hadn't laughed in months. Greta was the first to descend, her boots hitting packed earth that radiated stored sunlight even though the sun was already bleeding toward the western mountains. She'd been a signals operator, intercepting Allied communications in Tunisia until the entire Africa Corps collapsed like a house of cards. Now she was 26 years old, a prisoner of war, and standing in what the Americans called Arizona. The landscape was savage in its beauty. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels with their arms raised in permanent surrender, casting long shadows across the compound. Mountains ringed the horizon in layers of purple and amber, their peaks sharp enough to cut the cloudless sky. The air itself seemed to shimmer, distorting everything beyond 50 meters into a wavering mirage. "Jesus Christ," whispered Annalise Hoffman, stumbling down behind her. Annalise had been a nurse, captured when their field hospital was overrun. Her hands still moved with that careful precision even when there was nothing to bandage, nothing to fix. "Is this hell? Did we die and no one told us?" "Hell would be cooler," muttered Frida Braun, the oldest among them at 42. Frida had been a radio technician, her fingers still stained with solder burns that would never fully heal. She'd lost 2 sons on the Eastern Front and her husband in the bombing of Hamburg. She had the eyes of someone who'd already seen the worst the world could offer. Until now, until this heat that made breathing feel like drowning in hot sand. The compound stretched before them, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fence and guard towers. But something was wrong. Something didn't fit the stories they'd been told about American prison camps, about interrogations and hard labor, and the systematic cruelty they'd been warned to expect. There were tables. Long wooden tables set up in the shade of a canvas awning. And on those tables, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, were buckets. Metal buckets, dozens of them, sweating with condensation. "Was this das?" someone whispered behind Greta. "What is that?" An American officer approached. A woman in her 30s with sandy hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that were kind but tired. Captain Sarah Morrison, her name badge read. She held a clipboard, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at them, really looking the way you look at people and not problems. "Welcome to Camp Florence," she said in surprisingly good German, learned from her grandmother who'd emigrated in 1923. "I know you're exhausted. I know you're frightened. I know this heat is unlike anything you've experienced." She gestured toward the tables. "Those buckets contain ice water. Not cold water. Ice water. With actual ice. You may drink as much as you need. You may pour it over your heads if you wish. You are not required to ask permission. You are not required to wait. This is not a trick." The women stood frozen, not from cold but from confusion. This violated every assumption, every warning they'd received during their capture and transport. German officers had told them what to expect from American imprisonment. Starvation rations, forced marches, reprisals for what the Reich had done in occupied territories. The Americans would be vengeful, they'd said, cruel, efficient in their hatred. But there was ice, actual ice, in the middle of the Arizona desert. In August, Greta's throat was so dry she could feel each breath scraping its way down. She'd been rationed to half a canteen during the journey, the water warm and tasting of metal. She looked at Captain Morrison, searching for the trap, the catch, the moment when kindness would reveal itself as another form of torture. "Go ahead," the captain said softly. "Please, before someone passes out, and I have to file paperwork." It was the joke, small, almost inappropriate, that broke the spell. Annalise moved first, her nurse's instincts recognizing genuine medical concern beneath the bureaucratic humor. She walked to the nearest bucket, lifted the ladle with trembling hands, and drank. The sound she made was involuntary, something between a sob and a gasp. She drank again, then poured water over her head, soaking her hair and uniform, not caring that she looked like a drowned cat. She started crying, and the crying spread like contagion through the group. Greta found herself at a bucket, the ice clinking against the metal like tiny bells. She drank, and the cold was so shocking it hurt her teeth, hurt her throat, hurt her chest as it went down. She drank again anyway, and again. The water tasted clean, impossibly clean, with none of the mineral harshness or chemical treatment she'd grown accustomed to. Tasted like snow melt, like mountain springs, like something from a world before the war. Frida stood next to her, both hands gripping a ladle, water dripping down her chin and neck. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "Why would they do this?" "I don't know," Greta admitted. But she was crying too, and she didn't know if it was from relief or confusion or the simple, overwhelming fact that someone had thought to provide ice in the desert for German prisoners who were supposed to be the enemy. Captain Morrison moved among them, not supervising but ensuring everyone reached the water. She said nothing, just guided the women who seemed too disoriented to move on their own. When the youngest of them, barely 19-year-old Liesel Koch, a telephone operator from Munich, collapsed from heat exhaustion, the captain was there immediately, calling for medics with swift efficiency. "Get her to the infirmary for fluids, and someone open the windows, I want cross-ventilation. Move." 2 American medics arrived with a stretcher, their movements professional and unhurried. They lifted Liesel gently, speaking to her in English words she couldn't understand but with tones that needed no translation. "You're safe now. We've got you. You're going to be okay." As the sun finally touched the mountains, turning the sky into layers of orange and pink and deep purple, Greta stood with her back against the wall of a barracks, her uniform still damp from the ice water, and tried to reconcile what she'd been told with what she'd just experienced. The war had taught her that enemies were supposed to be simple. You fought them, you feared them, you hated them with a clarity that required no thought. But the Americans had given them ice. In the desert, on the first day, without being asked, without demanding anything in return. She watched Captain Morrison consulting with a sergeant about quarters for the night, about meal schedules, about medical assessments. The captain moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before, but there was no callousness in it, no casual cruelty masquerading as procedure. "Greta!" Anneliese appeared beside her, her hair still wet, face flushed from sun and emotion. "Did you see the infirmary when they took Liesel? It has screens on the windows, actual screens, and fans, electric fans. I saw. This isn't what we were told to expect." "No," Greta agreed. "It isn't." Inside the nearest barracks, they could hear other women discovering their sleeping arrangements. Actual cots with mattresses, not straw pallets on the floor. Thin mattresses, yes, but mattresses nonetheless. And above each cot, a small shelf for personal belongings, as if they were people who might have possessions, who might need dignity even in captivity. As darkness finally brought a measure of relief from the heat, though the air remained warm, just no longer actively hostile, Greta lay on her assigned cot and stared at the ceiling. Through the window, she could see stars emerging in stunning clarity, unpolluted by city lights or factory smoke. The desert night was coming alive with sounds. Crickets, distant coyotes, the soft conversations of American guards changing shifts. And somewhere in the camp, machines hummed, producing more ice for tomorrow's heat. Ice for the enemy. Ice for women who'd served the Wehrmacht, who'd been part of the apparatus that had brought so much destruction to the world. Greta closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept thinking about those buckets, about Captain Morrison's tired kindness, about the sound Anneliese had made when she tasted that first ladle of impossibly cold water. She thought about her mother in Hamburg, if she was even still alive after the bombing raids. She thought about her brother Klaus, missing on the Eastern Front, probably dead in some frozen field whose name she'd never know. And she thought about ice, simple ice, in a desert, waiting for them. The Americans had given them ice, and somehow that felt more disorienting, more world-shattering than capture itself. Because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, the world was more complicated than the binary of friend and enemy, us and them, victor and vanquished. Tomorrow would bring more questions. Tomorrow would bring the full weight of captivity, the reality of their situation, the long uncertain wait until the war ended and they could learn what, if anything, remained of their lives back home. But tonight, Greta lay in a bed that wasn't a transport vehicle or a holding cell, in a room with windows that let in the desert breeze, and tried to understand what it meant that their captors had thought to provide ice on the hottest day of the year. The first full day in Camp Florence began at dawn, when the temperature was merely unbearable instead of apocalyptic. Greta woke to the sound of a bell. Not harsh or military, just a simple bronze bell someone rang outside the mess hall to signal breakfast. Through the window, she could see the eastern sky turning from deep purple to pale gold, the mountains etched in sharp relief against the coming day. Around her, the other women stirred with the cautious movements of people still uncertain if they were safe. Annalise was already up, making her cot with hospital corners that spoke to years of training. Frida sat on the edge of her bunk, rubbing her face with both hands, her gray hair loose around her shoulders making her look older than her years. "I dreamed I was home," Frida said to no one in particular. "In my kitchen, making strudel. Then I woke up and remembered there is no kitchen. The house is rubble. Everything is rubble." No one responded because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be a lie or a platitude. They dressed in the clean uniforms that had been provided, German uniforms, interestingly, not American prison clothes. Someone had laundered them, removed the worst of the travel stains, even mended a few tears. Small acts of basic decency that felt enormous in their implications. The mess hall was already filling with women from other barracks when Greta's group arrived. She recognized faces from the transport, women she'd barely spoken to during the journey, now reassembled in this strange purgatory of American captivity. The room smelled of coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute they'd been drinking in Berlin for the past 2 years, and something baking. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the hall, waiting until everyone had found seats. She didn't demand silence or attention. She simply waited with patient confidence until the room settled on its own. "Good morning," she said in German. "Today we're going to establish the routines that will govern your time here. I know this is difficult. I know you're far from home, uncertain about the future, worried about your families. I can't eliminate those worries, but I can tell you what to expect while you're in our care." She outlined the daily schedule with businesslike clarity. Breakfast at 6, work assignments at 7, lunch at noon, free time in the afternoon during the worst heat, dinner at 5, lights out at 9. The work would be varied: laundry, kitchen duty, administrative tasks, light maintenance. Nothing hazardous, nothing that could be construed as contributing directly to the American war effort per the Geneva Conventions. "You are prisoners of war," Morrison continued, "but you are also human beings under our protection. You will be treated with the basic dignity that status requires. You will have access to medical care, adequate food, and shelter. You may write letters home, though they will be censored for security purposes. You may receive letters, subject to the same restrictions. You may practice your religion. You may maintain your language and culture. What you may not do is escape, cause violence, or engage in sabotage. Is this clear?" A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the hall. Greta studied Morrison's face, searching again for duplicity and finding only exhaustion. The captain looked like someone who'd spent too many nights dealing with problems that had no good solutions. Someone who'd learned to do difficult things with competence, if not comfort. "One more thing," Morrison added. "Some of you may have heard stories about American prison camps. Some of those stories are true. Some are propaganda. I won't tell you which is which because you'll have to decide that for yourselves based on what you experience here. What I will tell you is this. My job is to keep you safe, healthy, and humanely confined until this war ends. That's what I intend to do." Breakfast was oatmeal with raisins, toast with butter, and oranges. Actual fresh oranges, their peels bright against the metal trays. Greta hadn't seen fresh fruit in months. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about what her mother might be eating in Hamburg, if she was eating at all. "This is wrong," muttered Hilda Weber, sitting across from her. Hilda had been a cryptographer, brilliant with codes and patterns, terrible with people. They shouldn't be feeding us this well. It makes it harder. Harder for what? Annalise asked. Harder to hate them, Hilda said bluntly. Harder to remember we're enemies. That's the point, isn't it? They're trying to make us forget. Or, Frida suggested, they're just feeding us breakfast. Maybe not everything is psychological warfare. Everything is psychological warfare, Hilda insisted. That's how it works. They treat us well, we feel grateful. We start thinking maybe they're right and we're wrong. Maybe Germany deserves to lose. Maybe everything we believed was a lie. Maybe it was, Greta said quietly, surprising herself. The table fell silent. Around them, other conversations continued, women discussing work assignments, comparing letters from home, trading rumors about the progress of the war. But their small group had gone still, as if Greta had spoken something unspeakable. I intercepted communications, Greta continued, her voice low. For 2 years in Africa. Allied transmissions. British, American, Australian. And you know what I never heard? I never heard them planning the kinds of things we did. The reprisals against civilians. The systematic destruction. She stopped, because even here, even as prisoners, some things were too dangerous to say aloud. We followed orders, Hilda said. But her voice lacked conviction. Yes, Greta agreed. We did. And look where it brought us. The first work assignment was in the laundry facility. A long building with industrial washing machines and drying lines strung across the yard. Greta was assigned there along with 8 other women. Overseen by an American corporal named Danny Martinez who spoke no German but communicated through gestures and a genuinely friendly smile. The work itself was meditative in its simplicity. Sorting, washing, hanging, folding. Army uniforms, mostly American soldiers' clothes that had to be cleaned and returned to rotation. Greta found a strange comfort in the routine, in the smell of soap and hot water, in the weight of wet fabric and the satisfaction of producing something clean from something dirty. During a break, sitting in the shade with cold water from one of the ever-present ice buckets, Annalise said, I keep thinking about my hospital in Tunis. The British soldiers we treated after they were wounded. We were told to provide minimal care, just enough to keep them alive for interrogation. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't let them suffer when I had morphine, when I had bandages. So I treated them properly, and my commanding officer looked the other way because he couldn't do it either. What happened to him? Greta asked. Killed in the shelling. 3 days before we surrendered. Annalise stared at her hands. He was 47 years old. He had grandchildren. He showed me pictures. And he died because he was standing between the wounded and an artillery strike, trying to move patients to safety. Was he a good man? Frida asked. I don't know, Annalise admitted. He wore the uniform. He said Heil Hitler when required. But he also protected Allied prisoners and died trying to save people who would never even know his name. So what does that make him? Good? Bad? Just human? The question hung in the hot air, unanswerable. In the afternoon, during the prescribed rest period when the temperature reached 115 degrees and even the Americans retreated to shade and fans, Greta lay in her bunk and read a book from the camp library. They had a library, an actual library with books in German, donated by the Red Cross or confiscated from German ships or acquired through means Greta didn't understand. She'd chosen Goethe, something she'd studied in school a lifetime ago, when the world made sense and her biggest concern was passing her exams. Liesel, the youngest, occupied the bunk next to hers. The girl had recovered from her heat exhaustion but remained quiet, spending hours writing letters that she never seemed to finish. She'd write a few paragraphs, cross them out, start again, her face contorted with the effort of finding words adequate to her situation. Who are you writing to? Greta asked gently. My mother, my brother, my fiancé. Liesel's voice was barely audible. But I don't know what to say. Dear mother, I'm a prisoner in America, and they're feeding me oranges while you're probably starving in the ruins of Munich. Please don't worry. How can I write that? You write what you can, Greta said. Even if it's just, I'm alive. I love you. I'm thinking of you. That's enough. Is it? Liesel looked at her with eyes too old for her face. Is anything enough when the world is ending? That evening, during dinner, beef stew with vegetables, bread that was only slightly stale, and more of that incredible fresh fruit, Captain Morrison made another announcement. The camp would be showing a movie the following Saturday. A Western, probably, or maybe a musical. Entertainment approved for the prisoners. A gesture toward normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. Can you believe it? Someone whispered. Movies. Like we're on holiday. But it didn't feel like holiday. It felt like something else. Something Greta struggled to name. It felt like being shown that you could still be human even when stripped of freedom. That captivity didn't require cruelty. That enemies could still recognize each other's basic humanity without surrendering their opposition. After dinner, Greta walked the perimeter of the compound with Frida and Annalise, staying carefully within the allowed boundaries marked by white-painted stones. The evening air was finally cooling, the mountains turning from purple to black against a sky suddenly full of stars. My husband wrote to me once from the Eastern Front, Frida said suddenly. He said the worst part wasn't the fighting or the cold or even the fear of dying. It was the moments between battles when you had time to think, to remember you were human. Those moments, he said, were harder than combat because they made you question everything. What did he question? Annalise asked. Why we were there. What we were fighting for. Whether the people he was killing had families who would grieve them the way I would grieve him if he didn't come home. Frida's voice was steady, but her hands shook. He didn't come home. And now I'm here, and I keep thinking about those questions. About what we've been part of. About whether there's any redemption for people like us. We followed orders, Annalise said. But it sounded like a question now, not a defense. Following orders doesn't absolve us, Greta said. I knew that even before this. I knew it when I intercepted messages about refugee columns and security operations and all the euphemisms we used to describe things we couldn't bear to name clearly. I knew it, but I kept working because what else could I do? Refuse and be shot? Desert and endanger my family? So I compromised, and my compromises added up to complicity. They walked in silence after that. 3 women in prison uniforms, guards watching from towers, the desert night wrapping around them with its strange beauty and harsh truths. Back in the barracks, Greta finally finished the letter she'd been writing to her mother. She kept it simple. I am safe. I am treated well. I think of you constantly. When the war ends, I will find you wherever you are and we will rebuild together. I love you. Your daughter, Greta. She didn't mention the ice buckets or the oranges or Captain Morrison's tired kindness. She didn't mention the questions that kept her awake at night or the slow, terrible realization that everything she'd been taught to believe might have been built on foundations of lies. She just wrote about love and hope and the determination to survive, because those were the only truths that felt safe enough to speak. Liesel approached her before lights out, holding her own letter. Will you read this? Tell me if it's too much. Greta read the careful sentences. The young girl's attempt to reassure her mother while being honest about her circumstances. It was heartbreaking in its earnestness, in its desperate hope that saying the right words might somehow protect the people she'd left behind. It's perfect, Greta told her. Send it. That night, as she drifted toward sleep, Greta thought about the strange mathematics of war and captivity. They'd been given ice and oranges and books and movies, treated with a basic decency that challenged everything they'd been told to expect. And in return, they were being forced to confront questions they'd spent years avoiding. What had they been fighting for? What had they been part of? What did it mean to be human when your humanity had been conscripted into serving inhumanity? The ice buckets, she realized, weren't just about preventing heat stroke. They were about something more complicated, more challenging. They were about forcing prisoners to see their captors as people capable of kindness, which meant acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, the enemy had been more human than the propaganda suggested. And if the enemy was more human than advertised, what did that say about everything else? The first crack in the cautious peace came 3 weeks into their captivity, when Inga Schneider received a letter from home. Or rather, what was left of home. Greta was folding laundry when she heard the scream, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the mechanical hum of washing machines and the soft conversations of women at work. She dropped the uniform shirt she'd been holding and ran toward the sound, finding Inga collapsed against a wall, a letter clutched in her fist, her face drained of all color. Annalise was already there, checking Inga's pulse with practiced efficiency. She's in shock. Get her to shade. Someone bring water. They moved her carefully, supporting her weight between them, settling her on a bench under the awning where the ice buckets waited in their constant vigil against the heat. Inga stared at nothing, her breathing shallow and rapid, the letter still crushed in her grip. Inga, Annalise said gently, I need you to breathe with me, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that? It took 5 minutes before Inga could speak, and when she did, the words came out flat and dead. Dresden, they're gone. All of them. My parents, my sister, my nieces, the whole neighborhood. Firebombing. They say the whole city burned. The silence that followed was terrible in its completeness. Everyone within earshot stopped working, stopped moving, stopped pretending they weren't listening. Dresden. They'd all heard rumors about Dresden, about bombing raids that turned the city into an inferno, but hearing it was different from receiving it in a letter from someone who'd been there, who'd counted the dead. When? Frida asked, her voice rough. February. 5 months ago. Inga looked up, her eyes wild with grief and fury. 5 months and I didn't know. I've been here drinking their water and eating their food and watching their movies while my family burned. While they burned, Frida. While the Americans and British turned my city into an oven. The accusation hung in the air, complicated and terrible. Because the Americans had given them ice and oranges, yes, but they'd also dropped fire on German cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in raids that made no distinction between soldiers and children, between military targets and residential neighborhoods. Captain Morrison appeared within minutes, summoned by one of the guards who'd recognized a crisis in the making. She approached Inga carefully, maintaining distance, her hands visible and empty. I'm sorry for your loss, Morrison said in German. I know that doesn't change anything. I know words don't bring back the dead. Sorry? Inga's voice rose, shrill with grief and rage. You're sorry? Your Air Force did this. Your bombs. Your pilots. And you're sorry? Yes. Morrison didn't flinch or defend or explain. I'm sorry. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it just. But I am sorry that you've lost your family. But you'd do it again, Inga spat. If ordered, you'd load those bombs and burn another city. Wouldn't you? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was tired. I don't know. I hope I'd have the courage to refuse. I hope I'd be brave enough to face a court-martial rather than participate in something like that. But I don't know if hope is the same as honesty, and I won't lie to you about what I might do when faced with orders and consequences. It was perhaps the most honest answer anyone had given them since capture, and somehow that made it worse. Because Morrison wasn't a monster or a propagandist. She was just a person doing a job in a war that had long since blurred every moral line into meaningless gray. The incident with Inga opened a wound that had been festering beneath the surface of their cautious accommodation. That evening, after dinner, arguments erupted in the barracks. Women who'd been maintaining careful civility suddenly turning on each other. All their suppressed fears and resentments boiling over. How can you sit there and eat their food? Hilda demanded of Annalise. How can you smile at the guards and say "Danke" when they give you water? Don't you understand what they've done? What we've all done, you mean? Annalise shot back. Or have you forgotten the cities we bombed? The villages we burned? The people we... She stopped, looking around at the listening faces. We're all covered in blood, Hilda. All of us. The only question is whether we're going to drown in it or learn to live with the stains. That's capitulation talking, Hilda insisted. That's what they want, for us to forget who we are, to start believing their version of the war, to think that maybe we deserved everything that happened to us. Maybe we did, Greta said quietly, and the room went silent. What? Hilda turned on her, eyes blazing. What did you just say? I said maybe we did deserve it. Greta stood up, feeling the weight of every eye in the barracks. Not the civilians. Not the children. Not the people who had no choice. But us? The ones who wore the uniform, who followed the orders, who saw what was happening and stayed silent. Maybe we did deserve to lose everything. You're talking treason, Hilda whispered. No, Greta said. I'm talking truth. I intercepted communications for 2 years. I know what we did in the occupied territories. I know about the camps, the massacres, the systematic destruction of entire communities. I knew, and I kept working because it was easier than confronting what that knowledge meant. So yes, maybe we deserve to lose. Maybe the fire that fell on our cities was just the universe balancing the scales. The universe doesn't balance scales, Frida said, but her voice lacked conviction. The universe doesn't care about justice. Only people care about justice, and people are mostly too tired or too frightened to do anything about it. The argument dissolved into smaller conversations, women retreating to their bunks to process privately what they couldn't discuss publicly. But something had shifted. The careful denial that had protected them from full acknowledgement of their complicity had cracked, and through that crack, harder questions were beginning to seep. The second major conflict came a week later, during a work rotation in the administrative building. Greta had been assigned to help sort mail, letters to and from prisoners, all requiring review and censorship before being sent or delivered. It was tedious work, reading other people's desperate attempts to maintain connection across continents and war zones, but it was cooler than the laundry and quieter than the kitchen. She was working alongside Corporal Martinez when she came across a letter that made her stop breathing. It was from a German prisoner in a different camp, written to his sister in their compound. But it wasn't the content that froze her. It was the handwriting. She knew that handwriting. She'd seen it on reports and manifests and orders throughout her time in Africa. Klaus, her brother Klaus, who was supposed to be missing on the Eastern Front, presumed dead. Her hands shook as she read. Dear Heidi, I am alive. I surrendered to Americans in France after the failed counteroffensive. I am in a camp in Texas. They treat us well enough. I think of Greta constantly, wondering if she survived Africa. If you hear from her, tell her I am sorry. Sorry for believing the lies. Sorry for the things I did before I understood what we were really fighting for. Tell her I love her and I hope she's somewhere safe. Your brother, Klaus. But the letter wasn't addressed to anyone named Heidi in Camp Florence. It was addressed to a Heidi Schneider in Barrack 7. Inga's sister? No. Inga's sister was dead, killed in Dresden. So who was this Heidi? Problem? Corporal Martinez asked, noticing her stillness. No, Greta managed. Just, can I keep this one? It's from my brother. I didn't know he was alive. Martinez looked uncomfortable. Technically, it's addressed to someone else. But, he glanced around, then lowered his voice. Take it. Make a copy if you want. I'll pretend I didn't see. It was a small mercy, the kind that could get Martinez in trouble if discovered. Greta memorized every word before returning the letter to the pile, then spent the rest of the shift in a daze. Klaus was alive. Klaus had surrendered. Klaus was sorry. That evening, she found the Heidi the letter had been addressed to. Not Inga's sister, but a woman from a different transport. Someone Greta had never spoken to. Heidi Zimmerman was 40, a former schoolteacher, with the patient demeanor of someone used to dealing with difficult situations. Your brother and I. Heidi paused, choosing words carefully. We met in France before the surrender. We were both part of the retreat. We talked about what we'd do after the war if we survived. He told me about you, about his sister who could decode any cipher, who could find patterns in chaos. He was so proud of you. He surrendered? Greta asked. Chose to surrender? We all did, Heidi said. 37 of us. We were surrounded, running out of ammunition and food, and our commanding officer said we could either fight to the death or surrender with honor. We chose life. Some called it cowardice. I call it sanity. The conversation spread through the barracks like fire through dry grass. Klaus Schuller had surrendered, chosen captivity over death. And if one soldier could make that choice, what did it say about all the others who died fighting battles that were already lost? He broke his oath, Hilda said coldly. Soldiers don't surrender. They fight until victory or death. That's the same logic that's gotten millions killed, Frida countered. My husband died in that logic. My sons died in it. And for what? For a Reich that's now reduced to rubble? For a Führer hiding in a bunker while cities burn? No. Your brother chose life, Greta. That's not cowardice. That's the first intelligent decision any of us have made in years. But the debate revealed deeper fractures in the camp. Some women clung desperately to their identity as German soldiers, as members of the Wehrmacht who'd served with honor regardless of what the regime had done. Others, like Greta and Anneliese and Frida, were beginning to question whether honor had any meaning when attached to a cause so fundamentally corrupt. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The third crisis came from an unexpected direction. The ice itself. The machines that produced it ran constantly, powered by generators that burned fuel shipped from American supply depots. One morning in September, the machines stopped. Not because of mechanical failure, but because a supply convoy had been delayed by storms, and there was no fuel to run them. The temperature that day reached 118 degrees. Without ice, without the cold water that had become their lifeline against the desert heat, women began collapsing by mid-morning. The infirmary filled with heat casualties, dehydration, heat exhaustion, 2 cases of heat stroke that could have been fatal without immediate intervention. Captain Morrison appeared in the barracks at noon, her uniform dark with sweat, her face grim. The convoy should arrive tonight. Until then, we're implementing emergency protocols. Everyone to the mess hall. It has the best. Captain Morrison appeared in the barracks at noon, her uniform dark with sweat, her face grim. The convoy should arrive tonight. Until then, we're implementing emergency protocols. Everyone to the mess hall. It has the best ventilation and shade. But Greta noticed something else. The American guards were suffering too, their faces red and dripping, yet they'd given their own water rations to the prisoners first. Morrison herself looked dangerously dehydrated, swaying slightly as she spoke. Captain, Greta said in careful English, you need water. Sit down. Morrison waved her off. My people first, then yours, then me. That's the order. That's stupid, Frida said bluntly in German, then pulled Morrison down to a bench and forced a cup to her lips. Drink. A dead commander helps no one. In that moment, a German prisoner giving water to her American captor. Something fundamental shifted. The convoy arrived at dusk with fuel and fresh supplies. The ice machines hummed back to life. But the crisis had revealed what kindness alone could not. They were all just people, trapped in circumstances none of them had chosen, trying to survive with whatever dignity they could salvage. 3 months later, news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Florence on a crackling radio. The war was over. They had lost. Everything they'd fought for had collapsed into rubble and recrimination. Greta expected jubilation from the Americans, cruelty from the guards, triumph from their captors. Instead, Captain Morrison simply said, "You'll be going home soon. Start preparing." Home. The word felt hollow. What home? What Germany? What life remained in the ashes? But there was Klaus, alive in Texas. There was her mother, if she'd survived Hamburg. There was the possibility, fragile and uncertain, of rebuilding something from the ruins. On her last day in Camp Florence, Greta stood by the ice buckets one final time. The desert heat pressed down as it always had, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human kindness. But the ice remained, melting slowly in the sun, proof that even in the harshest conditions, people could choose mercy over cruelty. "What will you do?" Anneliese asked, standing beside her. "After. Find my family. Tell them I love them. Try to understand what we were part of, and maybe someday find a way to be better." Greta paused. "And you?" "The same. All of us the same." They boarded trucks heading east, back toward a Germany that no longer existed, back toward an uncertain future. But Greta carried with her the memory of ice in the desert, of enemies who chose humanity over hatred, of the complicated truth that the world was never as simple as propaganda made it seem. War had taught her to hate, Captivity had taught her something harder, that people were capable of both terrible cruelty and unexpected grace, often simultaneously, often confusingly. The ice buckets had saved their lives. But more than that, they'd saved something else, the possibility of hope, of reconciliation, of believing that even after the worst humanity could inflict, there might still be a path forward. As the truck pulled away, Greta looked back one last time at Camp Florence, at the place where she'd been a prisoner and, paradoxically, had begun to feel free.